Came home early that Tuesday because my flight got canceled. That's the part nobody talks about. How the most ordinary inconvenience, a weather delay out of Denver, can split your life clean in two. Before the flight got canceled. After. I'd been married to my wife for 22 years. We had a 4-bedroom house in Naperville, Illinois. The kind of neighborhood where people wave at each other from driveways, and the HOA sends passive-aggressive emails about lawn height. We had a son, Liam, 17, who was all elbows and opinions and still needed me to proofread his essays even though he'd never admit it. We had 2 cars, a dog named Hershey who shed on everything, and a retirement account I checked more often than I should have. I was a project director at a mid-sized logistics firm called Hartwell Solutions. 21 employees under me. I was good at my job. Methodical. The kind of person who maps out a problem before reacting to it. My wife used to say that was my best quality. Later, she'd use it as an insult. You analyze everything to death. You never just feel anything. I thought about that a lot during the months that followed. She was in marketing. Senior brand manager at a company called Northfield Group. She was excellent at her job too. Persuasive, polished. The kind of person who could walk into any room and have it reorganized around her within 20 minutes. I admired that. I always had. The Denver trip was supposed to be 3 days. A vendor summit, quarterly reviews, the usual. I'd done the same trip twice a year for 6 years. My wife knew my schedule as well as I did. When the airline pushed my connection by 4 hours and then canceled it outright at 11:30 at night, I rebooked on an early morning Amtrak, got home by 6:45 a.m., and used my key. The house was quiet. I put my bag down in the entryway. Hershey didn't come to greet me, which meant he was upstairs. I noticed a man's jacket on the hook by the door. Dark gray. Not mine. I recognized it because I'd seen it before, at the Northfield Group summer barbecue 2 years ago. It belonged to my wife's division head, a man I'll call her colleague, though that word feels too clean for what he actually was. I'd shaken his hand at that barbecue. He'd smiled the way people smile when they already know something you don't. I stood in my own entryway for approximately 45 seconds. Then I walked back outside, sat in my car, and called my assistant to say I'd be working from home. My hands were steady. I was working from home. My hands were steady. I remember being surprised by that. I drove to a diner 2 miles away. I ordered coffee I didn't drink. I sat there for 2 hours, and I thought, this is the part that might be hard to understand if you're not wired the way I am. I didn't cry. I didn't feel rage, not yet. What I felt was a kind of terrible clarity. Like a fog I had known was there, suddenly lifted, and I could see the shape of things I'd been stepping around for months without naming them. The conference calls she took in the garage, the weekends she worked late in the home office with the door closed. The way she'd stopped asking about my Denver trips, even though she used to always ask. I'm a project director. My entire profession is noticing what's missing. I went back home at 9 a.m. His car was gone. She was in the kitchen in a bathrobe, and when I walked through the door, her face did something. I will never forget. A half second of pure panic, then immediately, seamlessly, a smile. Hey, you're home early. What happened? Flight canceled, I said. Denver had ice storms. Oh no, that's awful. She poured me a cup of coffee like she'd been waiting for me. Are you exhausted? I looked at her, I said. A little. I'm going to shower and catch up on some emails. She said, I'll make breakfast. That was the last normal conversation we ever had. I didn't confront her that day, or that week. I know people hear that and they want to shake me. Liam heard it later and literally said, Dad, why didn't you just say something? And the answer is complicated and also simple. I needed to know everything before I said anything. Once I spoke, the whole structure would shift, and I needed solid ground first. I'd watched colleagues go through divorces where they'd shown their hand too early and gotten nothing. I wasn't going to do that. So I documented. I'm not proud of some of what I did during that period. But I'm not ashamed of it either. I checked our shared phone plan. We were both on the same family account. I could see call logs. 3 to 4 calls a week to a number I didn't recognize, going back at least 9 months. Sometimes calls at 11 at night. Once, a call on Christmas Eve that lasted 40 minutes while I was putting together Liam's new desk from IKEA in the basement. I contacted a private investigator named Douglas. I found him through a referral from a college friend who'd gone through something similar 5 years before. Douglas was in his late 50s, ex-Chicago PD. with a gray beard and the flat affect of a man who had seen every version of this particular situation and stopped being surprised by it around 2009. He didn't offer sympathy. He offered process. That suited me fine. Douglas confirmed what I already knew within 10 days. Photographs, timestamps, location data. The man's name I already knew. What I didn't know, what made my stomach actually drop for the first time, was the second layer. Douglas had been thorough. He'd noted that, on 3 occasions, my wife and her colleague had met at the Northfield offices on weekends, when no one else was present, for extended periods. He couldn't know what was said, but he flagged it as worth noting, given her role in brand strategy and his role in business development at a company that had, as of 8 months ago, launched a new service line that was nearly identical to a Hartwell Solutions proprietary logistics model I'd been developing for 2 years. I read that line in Douglas's report 3 times. Then I called our company's legal team. It took another 3 weeks to determine whether what she had access to was significant. I didn't know exactly what she'd seen or heard. I sometimes talked about work at home, the way you do after 22 years, at the dinner table, on the couch, in passing. She was smart. She would have known what to listen for. Our legal team found enough, not a smoking gun, but enough of a pattern to constitute a serious problem. I handed it to our attorneys and told them to proceed quietly. Then I went home and made dinner. I need to say something about that period, those 5 weeks of knowing and not speaking, because it would be dishonest to make it sound clean. It wasn't. I slept in the same bed as my wife. We had conversations about Liam's college applications. We watched a documentary about deep-sea fish together on a Wednesday night, and she laughed at a part that made me laugh too. And I hated that I still laughed. I felt like I was living inside a building I knew was condemned, just trying not to step on the wrong floor. I called my brother one night from the driveway. He lives in Phoenix, and we talk maybe 6 times a year, but he's the person I call when things are serious. I told him everything. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "What do you need from me?" Not "I told you so." Not a speech, just that question. I told him I needed someone to know in case things went sideways. He said, "I've got you." I stayed in that driveway for a while after he hung up, just listening to the neighborhood. I talked to a divorce attorney before I said a single word to my wife. Her name was Patricia Holt, sharp, practical, with an office in downtown Naperville that smelled faintly of fresh paint. She laid out the landscape in terms I appreciated, straightforward, no false comfort, no dramatics. Illinois is an equitable distribution state, 22 years of marriage, 1 minor child, a jointly owned property, 2 income earners. She outlined what I should and shouldn't do. She told me not to move out. She told me not to threaten. She told me to be the person who looked calm in every room because that person almost always does better. I already was that person. I just needed someone to tell me it was an asset. I came home from that meeting, and my wife asked how my day was. "Good," I said. "Productive." She said, "You seem like yourself again. The Denver trip really took it out of you." I said, "Yeah, I think I've sorted out what I needed to sort out." She smiled. She had no idea. I told her on a Saturday morning in April, 9 weeks after I came home to find that jacket on my hook. Liam was at his girlfriend's house for the weekend. I'd made sure of that. I didn't plan for him to be there, but I was glad it worked out that way. I sat down at the kitchen table across from her with a folder on my phone. She was in the middle of making a grocery list. She looked up at me and something in my posture must have registered, because the pen in her hand went still. "We need to talk," I said. She put the pen in her hand, went still. "We need to talk," I said. She put the pen down. I told her I knew about her colleague. I told her I knew the timeline, 9 months at minimum. I told her I knew about the meetings at the Northfield offices on weekends. I told her I knew about the business information. Her face went through several expressions in quick succession. Shock first, then the specific look of someone calculating how much you actually know versus how much you're guessing. Then, when I put the folder on the table and she saw the documents, something collapsed behind her eyes. She didn't deny it. I'll give her that. What she said was, "Kevin, I can explain." And I said, "I'm not here to listen to an explanation. I'm here to tell you what happens next." She stared at me. I told her I'd filed the paperwork with my attorneys. I told her about the business information issue and that our legal team was already involved. I told her I wanted a clean, uncontested divorce, that I wanted the house put on the market, equitable split of assets, and primary custody of Liam with reasonable visitation for her, given that he was 17 and would likely have his own opinions. I told her that if she cooperated, I would keep the business matter as a civil issue between the companies. If she didn't, if she contested anything, if she tried to draw this out, I would have no reason to keep it civil. She was crying by the time I finished. Not the kind of crying designed to get a reaction. The real kind, where your face does things you can't control. "You've been planning this," she said. "Yes," I said, "because that's how I do things." "I never thought you'd actually—" "I know," I said. "That was your mistake." The person I hadn't planned for was Liam. He came home Sunday night to a different house than he'd left, not physically, but in every way that mattered. My wife had stayed in the guest room since Saturday. I told Liam I needed to talk to him when he got home, and I'd spent that Sunday rehearsing what I was going to say. I thought I had it right. I didn't. He sat across from me in the living room, and I told him as plainly and calmly as I could that his mother and I were divorcing, that it wasn't something I wanted, but that it was necessary, that it was an adult situation that I wouldn't ask him to take sides in. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "Is it because of someone at her work?" I was surprised. I asked what he meant. He said he'd seen a text on her phone 3 months ago. He'd been borrowing it to look up directions, and a message had appeared. He hadn't told either of us. He'd been carrying it around for 3 months. He was 17 years old, and he'd been carrying this for 3 months. I felt something shift in me that I still find hard to describe. I said, "Yeah, that's part of it." He said, "Then why are you acting like it's complicated?" I said, "Because it is. Even when someone does something wrong, the situation." He stood up. His voice got tight in a way it does when he's holding something back. He said, "Don't do that. Don't act like I'm a little kid who needs it." Softened. "Just say what happened." I looked at my son and I thought, "He's right. Your mother had an affair," I said, "and she made some professional decisions that hurt my company. Both things are true. I'm not going to pretend otherwise." He nodded once. Then he sat back down. We didn't say anything for a while. He didn't cry. He looked out the window. Eventually he said, "Where are we going to live?" I said, "I'd like you to stay here, with me, until I figure out next steps. But you're almost an adult, and I'm not going to tell you what to do." He said, "Okay." Then after a beat, "What about Hershey?" I said. "Hershey stays with us." Something loosened in his face. He nodded. That was it. I prepared a speech about how both his parents loved him and how none of this was his fault, and I never got to give it, and I think that was fine. Liam didn't need the speech. He needed me to be straight with him. It took me an embarrassingly long time to figure that out. The weeks that followed were not peaceful. I want to be honest about that. My wife hired an attorney of her own, and for a brief ugly window she explored contesting the asset split. I don't know what changed, whether her attorney gave her a realistic assessment, or whether she did the math herself on what full disclosure of the business matter would mean for her professionally. But within 3 weeks, she was back at the table, and the process moved forward. There was a period where she called me crying, more than once. I listened. I wasn't unkind about it, but I also didn't waver, and I think that surprised her more than anything. She'd seen me accommodate things for 22 years. She'd seen me analyze and consider and give the benefit of the doubt. She'd miscalculated that I would do it one more time. I never did find out who sent the anonymous email. I should explain that. 2 weeks into my investigation, before I'd spoken to Douglas, I received an email from an address I didn't recognize. A Gmail with a string of numbers. The kind that's clearly a throwaway. The email said only, "You should look more carefully at what's been going on." Nothing else. No name, no explanation. I forwarded it to Douglas, and he could find nothing useful. I thought about that email for a long time. I still think about it. Someone knew and decided to tell me, and then disappeared. I don't know if it was someone at Northfield who had a conscience, or someone who'd been wronged by her colleague and wanted to cause damage, or a stranger who'd stumbled onto something. I'll never know. But whoever it was, they gave me a head start, and the head start changed everything. If you're out there, thank you. The divorce was finalized 11 months after I walked through that door to find a jacket that wasn't mine. The house sold in 18 days. I rented an apartment in downtown Naperville for 6 months while I decided what I wanted next. And it turned out that what I wanted next took a different shape than I'd expected. I'd assumed I would want to stay close to Liam's school, keep my routines, minimize disruption. What I actually wanted, what surfaced once the noise quieted, was something I couldn't have told you existed a year earlier. I transferred to a new position. Different city, different team, a project I'd been offered twice before, and turned down because it hadn't been the right time. I took it. I moved to Portland in March, which sounds like a dramatic reset, and I guess it was. Liam visited over spring break, and we hiked a trail and ate at a ramen place, and talked more in 3 days than we had in the previous 3 months. He's applying to colleges now. He wants to study environmental science. I'm not surprised. He's always been the kind of person who notices what's underneath the surface of things. His mother and I coexist. That's the word for it. We communicate about Liam's schedule and finances and not much else. And there's a kind of professionalism to it that probably sounds cold, but actually works better for both of us than whatever we've been doing for the last several years of the marriage. I don't hate her. I'm not sure I ever did. I was angry. Yes. A controlled cold anger that did exactly what I needed it to do, and then, gradually, quieted. What I felt more than anything was grief, not for the marriage I'd lost, but for the one I thought I had. Those are different things. The business matter was settled as a civil dispute between the companies without going to court. I'm bound by confidentiality on the specifics, but I'll say this: Hartwell Solutions retained its position in the market, and the service line that had mirrored our model was quietly discontinued. I've had people ask me what the lesson is. Everyone wants the lesson. I think the lesson is that the ability to stay calm is not the same as the inability to feel. People saw me move through that period, quietly, methodically, without screaming or breaking things. And they assumed I wasn't affected. My wife assumed it. Her colleague assumed it, right up until he learned otherwise. Even my attorney, I think, was mildly surprised by my composure. But here's what they didn't see: the 45 seconds I stood in my entryway looking at a jacket that didn't belong there, before I walked back outside. The diner coffee I didn't drink. The Sunday I stayed in the driveway on the phone with my brother until the neighborhood got dark. The nights I lay awake in that condemned building and listened to the silence and understood, finally, that I'd been lonely inside my own marriage for longer than I'd admitted, and that maybe the betrayal had not appeared from nowhere but had grown in a silence we'd both been maintaining and both pretending wasn't there. None of that is what people see. They see the folder on the table, the attorney's office, the clean, decisive outcome. They say things like, "He walked away with his dignity." And I did. But dignity isn't the absence of pain. It's just what you do with it. Liam called me last week on a Thursday night, which he never does without a reason. I picked up prepared for some problem. A grade, a conflict, something with his girlfriend. He said, "I was just thinking." I wanted to say, "I think you handled everything right." I said, "I don't know if there's a right way to handle something like that." He said, "I know, but you were straight with me when it mattered. That counts." I held the phone for a second. I said, "So did you? You were carrying that for 3 months and you didn't fall apart. That's not nothing." He said, "Hershey helped." I laughed. He laughed. He laughed. We talked for another 40 minutes about nothing in particular. That's the thing about endings. They're not always what you imagined. Sometimes they're quieter. Sometimes they come in the form of a Thursday night phone call from a 17-year-old who laughs at the same things you do and has your eyes and is going to be fine. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes that's enough. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since all of this happened. Not in a mystical way. I don't believe the universe was sending me a message when that flight got canceled. Ice storms don't have intentions, but I do believe that the choices we make over years, quietly, in small increments, eventually produce conditions we can't ignore. The jacket on the hook didn't appear from nowhere. It was the end result of a long chain of things that had been set in motion long before that Tuesday morning by both of us. My wife made her choices. I'm not going to pretend I understand all of them, and I stopped trying to. What I know is that somewhere along the way, she decided the life we built together wasn't enough, or that she was entitled to something outside it, and she acted on that without telling me. That's the part that mattered most, not the act itself, but the sustained deception. Years of it. That takes a particular kind of decision, made over and over again, every single day. And I made my choices too. I stayed calm when I could have burned everything down. I documented when I could have confronted. I consulted Patricia before I spoke a single word to my wife. People sometimes frame that as cold, as though the absence of a screaming match means the absence of feeling. But I'd argue the opposite. The discipline to act from your head when your chest is on fire is one of the harder things a person can do. It doesn't come from being unfeeling. It comes from understanding that how you respond to a crisis becomes part of who you are, permanently. I didn't want to become someone I didn't recognize. The tricky part was Liam. I had planned for the logistics. I had not planned for a 17-year-old who'd been carrying a secret for 3 months and needed me to be straight with him, not careful. That moment, when he said, "Don't act like I'm a little kid who needs it," softened. That corrected something in me. I'd been so focused on protecting him from the fall that I'd forgotten he was already inside it. The most honest thing I did in that entire period wasn't the folder on the table or the call to the attorneys. It was saying plainly to my son, "Your mother had an affair, and it hurt this family, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise." He deserved that. He'd earned it by being honest himself, even when it was hard. What I'd call intelligence here isn't the strategy or the documentation. It's knowing what the situation actually required at each stage and responding to that, not to the situation you wished you had. Integrity is showing up the same way whether or not anyone is watching, whether or not it costs you something. And resilience isn't bouncing back quickly. It's being willing to sit inside the hard thing long enough to understand it before you move. I moved to Portland. I took the job I turned down twice. I hiked trails with my son over spring break and laughed at things I hadn't expected to laugh at. None of that happened because things worked out perfectly. It happened because I made a series of choices, under pressure, that I could live with afterward. That's the whole of it, really. You don't always get to control what lands on your doorstep. You only get to control what you do next.